As everybody knows, there has recently been an intense amount of diplomatic and military pressure in the Andean region of South America, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And as we also know, at the Rio Group Summit recently, hostilities ceased. Nicaragua and Venezuela pledged to reestablish diplomatic relations with the nation of Colombia. But I'd like to get a little bit more I'd like to have a little bit more depth than we got from the mainstream media in their reporting. So, I mean, we're going to go a little bit more deeply into it, and we'll get both sides, and we'll start with Colombia's version of the events that transpired. But before I start on that, I want to note, and I want to very strongly emphasize that no one on any side of the conflict disagrees that Colombia breached Ecuador's border. No one on any side of the conflict can possibly say that that is not a flagrant violation of international law. On occasion, it could be justified, but I think the facts very plainly and clearly show that Colombia really had no right to engage in the activity that it did. What winds up happening is that Colombia, with help from the FBI and the DEA, had wiretapped satellite phones. Satellite phones were one of the primary ways that the FARC, the Revolutionary Federal Armed Forces of Colombia, engaged in communications with Hugo Chavez and each other and other elements, other political and diplomatic elements involved in the hostage negotiations that had been taking place prior to the attack on March 1st. According to an unnamed source, on 2/27, those wiretap satellite phones were used to intercept a call between Raul Reyes and Hugo Chavez, and they were talking about hostage negotiations on that on that phone call. On March 1st, Colombia says it launched an attack on the FARC in the Granada area, and guerrillas reacted by firing back on Colombian helicopters, and the position from which they fired was on the Ecuadorian side of the border. Colombia says it responded about 1.8 kilometers, or just over 1 mile, inside of Ecuador's with bombs, and they followed up with troops to make sure that the insurgents were killed, and it had been clustered, and they launched an incredible amount of cluster bombs and other munitions on the camp of Raul Reyes, which did wind up with his assassination, and they also killed more than a dozen other FARC members. According to El Tiempo, one of the primary national newspapers of the state of Colombia, 83% of Colombians supported these actions, although the paper has been reported to have ties to Colombia's Vice President Francisco Santos Calderon. And so we don't know how reliable it can be, but it did seem that the general atmosphere in Colombia was one of support and that's because the FARC, obviously, it goes without saying, have engaged in terrorist activities, for instance, taking hostages. But it's also important to note that their activities have to be portrayed against the backdrop of what has been systemic and endemic state terror promulgated by the military of Colombia, and which this state terror is primarily supported by U.S. military aid, which amounts to about $600 billion a year, or $5.5 billion that are playing Colombia since the year 2000. After the attacks on March 1st, in what we could only proclaim to be a grand sense of irony, Colombian President Alvaro Uribe said, direct quotes, "Today we have taken another step against terrorism that does not respect borders." He said this a few hours following Colombia's blatant breach of the Ecuadorian border. So I guess there is a form of terrorism that has no respect for borders. It's called international aggression, which is what Colombia engaged in. I think it's very funny that somehow the use of terrorism was being used as a response to terrorism and being justified there. So. Now, Ecuador says the attack occurred about 3 kilometers, or closer to 2 miles, 1.9 miles to be exact, inside its country, and was actually a planned assassination, and that ground troops then breached the borders. Ecuadorian soldiers that went to what they thought was the aid of Colombian soldiers pinned down by FARC insurgent rebels, in actuality found that many of the dead were in sleeping clothes and determined that this was not an attack but a massacre. The president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, referred to the attack as such. A Mexican student staying with the FARC to study them had said that she was asleep and the camp was bombed, 2 or 3 hours later, the camp was bombed again. Juan de Dios Para, with the Latin American Association for Human Rights, called the events an invasion and a massacre. The response was very quick from Ecuador and Venezuela. They pulled their ambassadors. Venezuela closed their embassy. Colombia's foreign minister did apologize, and the government of Colombia did offer to compensate Ecuadorians affected by their breach of the border. It's important to note that this attack occurred directly after the successful negotiation by Senator Cordoba and Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, to release hostages held by the FARC, some of which have been held for years. These hostages who were released essentially denigrated the Uribe government of Colombia. They said, "Hey, they didn't do anything to help us," even to the point where when Cordoba requested some kind of area for the hostage release to take place, the Colombian military responded by bombing the area where it was going to take, which almost resulted in his death. That's important to note because that's very systematic within the confines of neoliberal political thought, in that if diplomatic activity appears to be working, you immediately engage in some kind of military response as to not only take attention away from the fact that diplomatic endeavors were working, but also to sabotage the future potential for diplomatic endeavors to work. Of course, the attack, like I said, based on the diplomatic stress placed on their region, also led to military responses by Ecuador and Venezuela. Both countries moved troops closer to the borders, although these troops stayed within the confines of their borders. Colombia did not mobilize troops closer to its borders in response. The response from Latin American countries was almost uniform. It varied, but it was almost uniform in regards to the fact that they all had nothing but negative things to say about Colombia's flagrant violation of international law and its blatant disrespect for its, brotherly neighbor Ecuador. But the responses definitely varied from the dissolution of diplomatic ties, as in the aforementioned cases of Ecuador and Venezuela. Nicaragua also pulled their ambassador and severed diplomatic ties, to strong condemnation of Colombia's activities. Chile, Brazil, Bolivia, and Argentina all wanted a sincere apology and explanation to Ecuador from Colombia. And these were very, very strongly worded. All of them were also tempered with the fact that they said nobody should go to war over this, but they also were very, very strongly worded to a head of state. Everybody, again, nobody involved in this disagrees with the fact that what Colombia did was a violation of international law. The Organization of American States brought it up in a special meeting, a special segment of their meeting when they met again, and they did declare that Colombia had violated Ecuador's sovereignty and international law, and they set up a special committee to investigate the incident further. The Colombian OAS ambassador Camilo Ospina, he didn't think very much of this and said the direct quote, "Internal affairs of Colombia will be resolved by the Colombian government." It's interesting to note too that he's talking about internal affairs of the Colombian government, but those so-called internal affairs cease to be internal affairs the exact moment that Colombian troops and Colombian missiles breached the Ecuadorian borders in what can only be seen as an outright planned assassination attempt. In part 2, we're going to get into other responses by Colombia. We're going to get into the response by various commentators on the left from websites such as UpsideDownWorld.org, ZMag, and VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And we're also going to very, very, very clearly prove the case that the only country that stood to gain anything from the intense amount of stress and tension in the region is the United States, and also that the only country in the region, despite allegations by Colombia following their attack, from so-called evidence that they got after their assassination, that the only country funding any kind of terrorists in the region is the United States.